body on the table still had its hands. That was the first thing Maren Voss noticed, because the others hadn't. 3 victims in 6 weeks, a dock worker, a schoolteacher, a retired engineer, and all of them had been opened with a precision that made the forensics team go quiet. Organs removed. Skeletal structure partially disassembled and reassembled wrong, like someone learning anatomy from a diagram rather than a body. But the hands were always left, and they were always folded, and Maren had stopped being able to sleep because of it. Respectful, her partner Davy said, standing at the foot of the gurney. He was the kind of man who chewed on observations before he spoke them, which she'd learned to read as caution rather than slowness. Whatever's doing this thinks it's being respectful. Or it's marking the work, Maren said. Hands folded means finished, done, catalogued. She wasn't wrong. She just didn't know yet how wrong she was about the scale. Tura Station had been a mid-tier colonial outpost for 40 years before the Kerath arrived. A half-terraformed moon orbiting a gas giant in a system with a name that sounded like a filing code. 12,000 people. Mineral extraction, hydroponic agriculture, a university annex that had been struggling for funding since before Maren was born. The kind of place that made the news when something broke and never otherwise. The Kerath hadn't come in ships. That was the detail that still made Maren's jaw tighten when she thought about it. They had come through a fold in orbital space that human instruments read as a sensor ghost. And by the time the station's defense grid recognized them as a threat, 17 of them were already inside the outer ring, humanoid in shape. That was the first surprise, and the worst one, because it made people hesitate. The second surprise was that they didn't attack. They observed, they collected, and then they were gone, leaving behind 3 dead and a pattern that made no sense until it did. The Kerath were builders, not in the abstract, spiritual sense. In the literal, technical sense. Their civilization ran on constructed biology, organisms engineered from harvested genetic material, assembled into workers, soldiers, navigators, interpreters. The more diverse the source material, the more adaptable the construct. And humanity, with its absurd genetic variance across 200 colony worlds and 8,000 years of isolated population drift, was the most interesting raw material the Kerath had encountered in a generation. This is what the man named Dale told Maren, sitting across from her in a maintenance corridor in the station's lower ring, in a voice that was 2 frequencies at once, and eyes that caught the light wrong. "You're one of them," she says. "I was made by one of them." He folded his hands on the table between them. The gesture was careful, deliberate, practiced, she realized, the way someone practices a language they learned from books. There's a difference. I've had time to understand it. His name, the name he'd given himself, was Dale. He'd been walking the station for 3 weeks, tracking the same case she was tracking, leaving her fragments she'd been reading as anonymous tips. He was tall and built wrong in ways that her eye kept sliding off, and his face was almost perfectly human except for the stillness of it, the way it didn't shift and settle the way faces did in conversation. He was the 3rd version of himself. The first 2, he said, had been deemed failures and dismantled. "Why help us?" Davy asked from the doorway. He hadn't come in. He was keeping his hand near his sidearm, which Maren thought was reasonable and probably useless. "Because I know what he's building," Dale said. He meant the architect. That was the word he used, the closest translation of a Kerath rank title. The being responsible for the harvesting, the one working under a cover identity, as a Kerath diplomatic liaison attached to the station's trade council. A position so mundane that no one had looked twice at him in 8 months, and because I would like it to stop. The architect's name in Kerath was a sound like 2 stones dragged across each other. The station's records had him as Vel Hadris, attached to a trade office that processed 3 low-volume cargo manifests a month. Maren pulled his file and found a face that was unremarkable in exactly the way that faces weren't unremarkable. Every feature calibrated to land in the center of normal and stay there. She'd passed him in the corridor outside the council chambers 2 weeks ago and had not remembered him until Dale put his face on her screen. "He's building a translator," Dale said. "Not a machine, a being. Something that can interface with human neurology directly, read intent, read emotion, read the gaps between what humans say and what they mean. The Kerath have no intuition for that. They've never needed it. Every civilization they've encountered either submitted or was removed. Humans are the first ones who've done neither." "We haven't done anything," Maren said. Dale looked at her. "You're still here." She thought about that for a long time after he left, after she'd decided to trust him, or at least to use him, which wasn't the same thing but was what she had. 40 years on tourist station. 12,000 people who'd carved a life out of a moon that had been uninhabitable rock when their grandparents arrived. The university annex that was always struggling for funding. Where Maren's sister had gotten her engineering degree. Where the memorial garden outside the atmospheric sciences building was full of names of people who died making the air breathable. The dock worker with the folded hands had been someone's father. The school teacher had coached the youth athletics program for 11 years. The architect was taking them apart to understand what made them persist. She found that offensive in a way she didn't have words for, which she eventually decided was fine. Not everything needed words. The case broke open in the way cases usually broke open. Not through brilliance but through patience and a small mistake. The architect's mistake was operational. He had a pattern, a timing, a preference for subjects who worked night shifts in the outer ring where the population density dropped and security response times doubled. Maren mapped it backward from the 3 victims and forward from the station's shift records and identified 7 possible next targets. She and Davi covered 3 of them personally, rotating every 4 hours. On the 9th night, she was in corridor J14 near the atmospheric processing substation when her earpiece clicked twice, Davi's signal, and went silent. She ran. The substation was a long rectangular room, full of the hum of scrubbers, and the smell of ozone and recycled air. Davi was on the floor, not dead but stunned, his eyes tracking but his limbs not responding. The architect was standing over the target. A young woman named Sarah, who maintained the overnight pressure systems, who had been on Maren's list, because she worked alone and late, and no one would miss her until morning. The architect had Sarah's wrist in one hand, and a device in the other that Maren had never seen before, and immediately understood was bad. She drew her weapon and said, "Let her go." The architect turned his head toward her. His face did the same thing Dale's did, the studied stillness, the calibrated features. But where Dale's stillness had always felt like restraint, the architect's felt like absence. Like something occupying a space shaped like a person. He didn't release Sarah. He looked at Maren the way she'd looked at evidence diagrams, with a technical interest that had nothing to do with her as a person, and everything to do with what she represented. "You've been following me," he said. His voice had the double frequency quality, but controlled, flattened down to almost nothing. "Practiced. For 11 days. You used predictive modeling." He seemed genuinely curious. "Kerath analysts modeled your behavioral range and assessed less than 4% probability that human investigators would identify a temporal pattern in my work. You exceeded the model." "We like to do that," Maren said. He tilted his head. She'd been watching Dale do the same gesture for weeks and had started to understand it as the Kerath equivalent of a frown, the expression of something not computing. "You're afraid," the architect said. "I can read the biochemical markers. Elevated cortisol, increased heart rate, and yet you're still standing in front of me. The model suggests flight behavior at this threat level. The model is wrong." She fired twice, not at him, because Dale had told her that the architect's constructed body would absorb standard rounds without significant effect, but at the device in his hand. The first shot clipped it. The second destroyed it. He dropped it on reflex and turned toward her fully, and she had exactly the 2 seconds she'd calculated before he covered the distance between them. Dale came through the wall, not through the door, through the wall, through the maintenance panel beside it, tearing it open with the quiet efficiency of something that had been waiting on the other side. He hit the architect from the left and the 2 of them went into the equipment racks with a sound like a car accident, and Maren grabbed Sarah and pulled her toward the door and kept herself between Sarah and the fight, even though every piece of self-preservation instinct she had was screaming at her to run. Because Davi was still on the floor, and she wasn't leaving Davi. She got Sarah to the door, went back for Davi, dragged him to his feet, got his arm over her shoulder, half air carried him out while behind her the sounds of the fight shifted. Less collision, more stillness, and then a silence that was worse than the noise. She made herself not look back. In the corridor, Davy found his legs. "The big one," he said. "Is he?" "I don't know," Maren said. Dale came out of the substation 40 seconds later. His face had a long split along the left cheekbone, not bleeding, just open, the edges clean in a way that human skin wouldn't be. He walked the way he always walked, with that deliberate, careful quality, but he was favoring his left side. He stopped when he reached them and looked at Sarah, who was pressed against the corridor wall, staring at him. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It landed somewhere in between, like he was learning the difference. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "Are you?" He seemed to not know what to do with the question. His head tilted, his mouth opened slightly, and then closed. "That's an unusual thing to ask," he said finally. "You just went through a wall for me." "I went through a wall for the investigative objective," he said, and then stopped, and something shifted in his face. Not much. A small tightening around the eyes that Maren had learned to read as the expression he made when he caught himself believing his own cover story. "And for you," he said, "both." The architect was not dead. Maren had stopped expecting things to be simple. He was damaged. Dale had done something to his internal systems that would require significant time to repair. A window measured in days rather than hours. And the evidence from the substation, combined with the access logs Dale had been quietly compiling for 3 weeks, was enough to pull the architect's diplomatic credentials and put him in a containment situation that the station council would spend the next 6 months arguing about, and the colonial authority would spend the next 2 years arguing about after that. This was how institutions worked. Maren had stopped expecting institutions to work quickly. What she hadn't expected was the debrief. The colonial authority sent a team, senior analysts, a xenobiologist, 2 officials whose exact roles were not specified, but whose questions made clear they were trying to figure out how this had happened before they figured out what to do about it. They were not unkind, they were very thorough. They had, Maren noted, also brought a Kerath observer. A different faction, Dale explained quietly, the political equivalent of a rival firm, who sat in the corner of the conference room and watched the proceedings with the particular attention of someone taking notes they planned to use later. At one point, the lead analyst asked Dale, in a tone that was professionally neutral, but contained something underneath it that Maren recognized as unease, what his plans were. Now that the case was closed, now that the threat was contained, Dale was quiet for a moment. He was sitting at the table the way he always sat, very still, hands folded on the surface in front of him. And Maren had stopped reading that as an affectation weeks ago and started reading it as something else. Something she didn't have a word for. The deliberate care of someone who had learned, at significant cost, how to exist in a world that hadn't been built for him. "I thought I might stay," he said, "if that's permitted." The analyst looked at him. "On Tura Station." "I'm useful," Dale said. "I understand both sides of a problem that isn't going to stop being a problem." The architect was one. There will be others. He paused. The Kerath are going to keep coming. They're going to keep trying to understand why humans persist. I think the answer is going to keep surprising them. "And you?" the analyst asked. "Do you understand it?" Dale looked at his hands. Then he looked across the table at Maren, who had been listening to this, and thinking about Sarah asking him if he was all right. About the small shift in his face when he'd caught himself being honest. About the 3 weeks of anonymous tips and the wall he'd gone through. "I'm beginning to," he said. The architect went into Colonial Authority custody on a Thursday. On Friday, Maren filed her case report and signed off on the evidence manifest and argued with Davi for 40 minutes about whether the overtime authorization would cover the repair costs for his equipment, which had gotten stepped on during the fight. On Saturday, she stood in the memorial garden outside the Atmospheric Sciences building, in front of the wall of names, in the particular cold that Tura Station's recycled air always carried at the end of a long week. Dale found her there. She hadn't told him she was going. She suspected he had followed her with the same systematic patience he'd used to follow the case, which she found she didn't object to. "This is where you come when you need to think," he said. "This is where I come when I need to remember why I do what I do," she said. "It's different." He stood beside her and read the names. She watched him read them. Watched the way his eyes moved, the careful, deliberate quality of his attention, the same quality he brought to everything. He had been made to understand humans. She thought he was beginning to, which was not the same as being made to, and the difference mattered in ways she was still working out. The architect thought persistence was a flaw, Dale said, a biological error, something that would be corrected with sufficient pressure. What do you think? He was quiet for a moment. The station's environmental system cycled. A low hum through the floor, the faint shift of recycled air. Outside, through the observation panel at the end of the garden corridor, the gas giant hung in the dark. Its bands of amber and cream turning slowly, the way things that were very large and very old always moved. I think it's the most interesting thing I've ever encountered, Dale said. The capacity to be afraid and continue anyway. To lose people and build memorials instead of stopping. To be taken apart in every sense and insist on putting yourselves back together. He paused. The Kerath have no word for it. They never needed one. What word would you use? He thought about it for longer than she expected. Long enough that she started to wonder if she'd asked the wrong question. And then he said, quietly in the double-frequency voice that she'd stopped noticing as strange somewhere around the second week. Stubborn. Maren laughed. It surprised her. A short, real laugh, the kind that came up without warning. Dale turned to look at her with the expression she'd learned to read as surprise. And then something else happened, something small, at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the direction of one. The Kerath didn't leave after the architect's arrest. They wouldn't. The diplomatic mission was real. The trade relationship was real. And the colonial authorities' position was that engagement was preferable to escalation. Which was the kind of sentence that people who didn't live on Tourist Station found easier to say than people who did. What changed was the nature of the engagement. The Kerath observer who'd been in the debrief room filed a report that Maren never saw, but that Dale summarized for her in a sentence. They are not what the models predicted. This was, as far as Maren understood Kerath political dynamics, either very good or very bad, and the difference would take years to sort out. She could wait. She was good at that. What she hadn't anticipated, and she'd come to accept that this was the nature of her work, the endless succession of things she hadn't anticipated, was the message from the university annex, from a xenolinguistics researcher named Professor Odell, who had been working quietly in an underfunded department for 6 years, on a project to develop communication frameworks for non-human intelligences, who had seen the preliminary debrief reports, which were supposed to be restricted, but weren't, because institutions leaked the same way they always had and always would, who wanted very politely to know if the constructed being called Dale would be willing to sit for a series of recorded conversations. For research purposes, Maren told Dale, handing him the message. He read it twice. She wants to learn how I think. She wants to understand how you learned to think the way you do, how you got from what you were made as to what you are. Maren paused. I don't think she's the only one who'd want to know. Dale was quiet for a moment. Outside the observation panel, the gas giant was in the phase where its larger moon crossed the face of it. A slow transit that took 4 hours and produced a shadow effect that the people of Tourist Station called the Eye. It happened every 42 days. The original settlers had named it on the second cycle, before the atmospheric processors were fully stable, before anyone was certain the colony would survive. They'd named it anyway. It would be strange, Dale said, being studied. You studied us for 3 weeks before you introduced yourself. He conceded this with the slight tilt of his head. Besides, Maren said, you said you wanted to stay. Staying means being part of things. Being part of things means being studied occasionally and studying back. She looked at him. That's how it works here. He looked at the Eye, the great shadow crossing the amber face of the gas giant, the same transit it had made for 1 billion years before any human being had looked up and decided to name it. He looked at it with the careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything. And for once, she couldn't read what he was thinking, which she'd come to understand was not absence, but depth. All right, he said. 3 months later, Maren sat in the back of a lecture hall in the university annex and listened to Professor Odell present preliminary findings to a room of 40 researchers, most of them bleary-eyed graduate students who had not expected to care about xenolinguistics and now could not stop thinking about it. Dale sat beside Odell at the front of the room, answering questions with the methodical patience that Maren had long since stopped reading as alien and now just read as him. The question that made the room go quiet came from a second-year student in the 3rd row. When did you decide you were a person? Dale looked at the student for a moment. The room was very still. Maren in the back row thought about hands folded on a morgue table, about a wall that had been torn open, about a laugh she hadn't expected. I'm not sure I decided, Dale said. I think I noticed. He paused. Someone asked me if I was all right, he said. After something dangerous. Not in a procedural sense, genuinely, in the way that you ask someone you're concerned about. And I didn't know what to do with the question. His voice was even. The double frequency present but soft. I've thought about it since. It seems to me that being asked if you're all right, by someone who actually wants to know, is one of the things that makes a person. Not the only thing, but one of them. The student in the third row wrote something down. Several of the others did too. Maren sat in the back row and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Outside the station turned. The gas giant hung in its orbit, patient and enormous, indifferent to the small heated dramas of the beings who had decided, against all practical advice, to make a life on one of its moons. The Kerath observer filed another report. The colonial authority issued another statement. The diplomatic mission continued, as diplomatic missions did, in the long and complicated way that things continued when no one could agree on how to stop them. The memorial garden held its names, the names held, and in a lecture hall, in an underfunded annex on a mid-tier colony moon that had never made the news for anything good, a being who had been made to understand humanity was beginning, slowly, and in the specific, irreplaceable way that understanding worked, to become part of it. That was the thing the architect had never modeled. That was the thing the Kerath had no word for. That was the thing that was going to matter.